Hey, thanks for joining me. Today, I wanted to discuss Resident Evil 5 and also 6 running on the Nintendo Switch 2. Resident Evil 5 is one of my favorite games. It's so cool, not necessarily because the AI that controls Sheva is particularly good. That's kind of a nightmare. But I spent a lot of time playing this game with a friend of mine, and we did the co-op, and man, we had so much fun. Especially since this was the first multiplayer Resident Evil. So I specifically want to explain why this game looks so good on Switch 2. There's no reason why this game should look this good on the Switch 2. So we see games, for example, if you run Breath of the Wild on Switch 2 and you don't purchase the upgrade pack, you tend to see the pixels of the 3D graphics. You can see where the console is not exactly rendering the game in a way that looks modern because the resolution looks low. You can see the jagged pixels. In other games, the rendering resolution internally is lower. It's much lower than you would expect it to be. It's much lower than what the Switch is capable of, and that's because the Switch hardware is a bit weak. The reason why Resident Evil 5 looks so great, not just on Switch, but Switch 2, comes down to a number of factors. Most notably, this game comes from the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 era, so it doesn't use shaders that are very demanding. Every game has a rendering budget. Everything that is seen on screen or loaded into memory and is running takes up part of your rendering budget. And if you run low on your rendering budget, it has nothing to do with money, but more about the capabilities of the hardware. Once you're low on rendering budget, the game struggles to run, and that's why we see Switch games that don't run at great frame rates. Whereas this game generally runs fine, but it does struggle in some places on the Switch. On Switch 2, however, it runs great. Resident Evil 6 runs great, and I was trying to figure out why the game looks so good. It looks much higher resolution than it should. I can tell that the game is rendering internally at 1080 in docked mode and 720 in handheld mode, but on Switch 2, it looks like the game is running at a higher resolution. Why is that? And what I've noticed is that Resident Evil 5, both 5 and 6, use a number of different post-processing effects. Most notably, it uses anti-aliasing very effectively, and that anti-aliasing basically tries to interpolate between pixels, so it's less jagged and it looks a bit smoother here. And it's done in a way to where it looks like the game is running at high resolution. The anti-aliasing basically smoothens out, harsh pixels, so you don't get those jagged edges, but it's a bit more than that. There are many techniques, many ways to implement that, and some of my games use anti-aliasing on Switch, or you can call it anti-aliasing if you want. It's a free country. No one's going to judge you for how you pronounce that word. And what I've noticed about Resident Evil 5 and 6 is that they use a technique that processes the image on screen, and I don't have any background knowledge. I haven't ever deconstructed the game or done any mods, but I can tell and strongly believe, I have reason to believe, that they are sending the game image to a render texture. So what that means is, instead of just rendering out the game and saying this is what the game looks like, what they're doing is they're basically taking a picture of every single frame and they send it to a texture, a render texture. A number of processing effects are performed on that texture, and then it is sent out to the screen for the player to see. Now, the reason why this makes such a big difference for Resident Evil 5 and 6 is that there's something about the Switch 2 that processes the textures so that it interpolates the pixel data for scaling up. So say, for example, you can have no filtering and the pixels are just harsh. That is something we see in 2D pixel style games. That is just no filtering. We generally see bilinear filtering. Bilinear filtering just smooths out textures. That's used on things in 3D games and environments. And something I've noticed with Switch 2 is that depending on the game, on the technique they use to implement the texture filtering on Switch 2, there's something about it that it upscales the textures, and it is basically increasing the pixel density as the picture is, or as the texture is sort of scaled up and shown on screen. If you open up Tetris 99, for example, that is a Switch game, but the heads-up display elements, the UI elements, they look like they are running at a significantly higher resolution than 720 in handheld mode or 1080 in dock mode. So basically that comes down to the Switch 2 has some sort of, it's using some sort of modern method to upscale textures in real time. And why that affects Resident Evil 5 and 6 is that instead of just showing the game, it's actually showing a texture. The entire game is actually being sent to a texture. The Switch 2 is naturally upscaling that texture. It's filling in pixel data as it's displaying it at a higher resolution, both in handheld mode and on screen. And it looks great because of this inherent universal way that the Switch 2 just filters and upscales textures. This is something that wasn't ever explained. Nintendo never said, oh, this is something the Switch 2 will do to improve graphics. It's actually just just a lucky implication. It just happens that the Switch 2 does this with textures. It wasn't really meant to enhance graphics specifically. It just happened that it turned out this way. And that is why Resident Evil 5 and 6 look so great, is that they render their game vision, their game view to a rendered texture. They're rendering the whole game to a texture, performing processes like a color grading, bloom. This game doesn't necessarily use depth of field, but there's color grading, there's bloom, anti-aliasing or aliasing, depending on which side of the Mississippi you come from. And it ends up making the game look higher resolution, even though it's not higher resolution, because the Switch 2 itself is just upscaling graphics. Now, I personally can't remember if you have this sort of free movement while walking in Resident Evil 5. It's been such a long time I've played it, but I was a little bit starstruck that I had so much free movement while walking, not running, but walking. And I was trying to remember, hey, does Resident Evil 5 actually, was this like this originally? I was trying to remember it. So at the moment, I'm adventuring and road tripping around California, and so I don't have access to my studio. I usually have my recording equipment, my other electronics, my props, my costume stuff, so my video formats are going to be different for a little while, a little bit more scrappy. And I kind of enjoy this sort of more down-to-earth, scrappy format. I'll share a little bit of some road tripping with you. I've just been enjoying exploring. I'll be spending more time in Sierra Nevadas in this coming week, so I'll share my adventures around there. I found this interesting covered bridge. It's in Roberts Ferry. There's a shop where they do very sweet milkshakes. Probably a little too sweet for me. I had one and really enjoyed it, but man, that was a lot of sugar. I walked through the covered bridge. It was really neat. There's some history there. There's lore drops. You can read those lore drops if you go there. It's very interesting. And people can walk under the bridge, and you can just hang out there, and you can probably do some fishing. The water under the bridge is not that deep. It's quite shallow, so it's perfect to go on in and wade around. I'll just put this on screen and share a little bit of a relaxing adventure vibe with you. Thanks very much for watching. Take care of yourselves. Be well.